great to be here. I did some of the research for this book here at Columbia and many, many other places in which we can talk about later. So, but if you look around this room, you see a lot of people who I'm sure have very heavily stocked bookcases at home with actual paper books like that book. And you've got books, and those books were written with pen, with pencil, typewriter, and word processor. But the books I'll talk about today were written differently. They were written with scissors. People made scrapbooks out of their reading, and everybody did that. It wasn't just, basically it was just understood that most people kept scrapbooks. Abraham Lincoln compiled one. Whether he made it himself or had somebody else do it, I don't know. But it was a way of keeping track of the coverage of his campaign and a way of keeping track of what he had said extemporaneously. You know, if he wrote 5 words on the back of an envelope, he didn't know what he'd said, but a reporter took it down. And his scrapbook clips more often the opposition press than his own press, because they figured those were more reliable accounts of his speeches. So we hardly know about this today, but nearly everyone did. So statesmen, also not just Lincoln, but Frederick Douglass, kept scrapbooks, again, about his speeches. And David Blight's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Douglass used this great trove of scrapbooks that he found about Douglass. And that, again, these are things that are, historians have used scrapbooks often, but they haven't usually addressed them as scrapbooks, and that's what I've done here. Also, writers used scrapbooks in order to collect work that they were going to use for their writings, as in this case, Virginia Woolf, which she collected lots and lots of clippings to use in Three Guineas. Again, I love that she used these, what look like canning labels to paste them down. I'm very curious to know more about this, but basically, I focus on the U.S., so I'm not sure what she was up to. So the list of celebrities and Mark Twain kept scrapbooks too, and then he actually went on and invented one, which we'll talk about later. Actors very often did, because their work was ephemeral, and so this is somebody who was well known, Molly Picon, and somebody who worked in film eventually, where the need to keep them was less. Fans started making scrapbooks, but the actors themselves didn't need them so much. But when they were stage actors going on circuits, pretty much everybody had a clipping book they could show to managers to see if they were worth hiring. Anyway, my list of celebrities is just to take advantage of your interest in stars, but it's more important that ordinary people, everybody, could make one. And they did that, and it was you just see endless ones like this of column after column of newspaper clippings. Not usually, this is unusual that it has a picture. Very often they don't have any kinds of pictures, and they're not pretty. But they are extraordinary as a record of what people read and what they made of it. They don't propose a simple argument. They're not well-crafted essays, nor are they modernist collages attentive to visual design or delighting in fragments. They're messy, they're raggedy, and it's one reason they've been disregarded. So why did thousands of people, tens of thousands of people in the US make them? Well, Gertrude Bastille Mazel, a journalist with the New York Freeman, a black paper, praised scrapbooks as unwritten histories. They were a way of creating something out of the newspapers that people had endlessly. Most, the New York, I forget how many, at various times it had something like 13 dailies. And papers piled up, but how are you ever going to find something in them? You have a big pile, you're not going to turn it up. So people would clip the paper and save what they wanted. They felt that the papers were valuable, they were tantalizingly valuable because they were so cheap, but not accessible. They didn't have indexes. They didn't have publicly published indexes for a very long time. Some newspapers had them. You could, if you were in the office at the New York Tribune, you could use their index, but it was not a public index. So you had to go make your own version of that. So there's lots and lots to be said about scrapbooks, but I'm going to look particularly today at two ways that political organizers used them for reading against the grain, and what this black journalist called creating unwritten histories. So I'm looking at African American activists and women's rights activists and their scrapbooks. But first, I'm going to tell you a little about scrapbooks in general. So here we have sort of the history of a scrapbook in a sense. There are lots of antecedents to scrapbooks. One of them is commonplace books, where people would copy out passages from their reading. But eventually it gets too cumbersome with so much reading. I mean, people do still make them. That practice continues. But the idea of saving everything you read doesn't work. And after a while, somebody like Caroline Healy Dow, who was an activist in various fields and also a really voluminous diarist, instead of continuing her commonplace book, after a while just started pasting things over the handwritten passages, as you can see here, and that happens elsewhere. But especially with the coming of the Civil War, newspapers took on a really important role in people's lives. That was where you looked to find out whether your friends and neighbors and family were dead or wounded. You looked to the newspaper to see the battlefield reports. And what made that so much more compelling and up to the moment was that news was arriving by telegraph in the North, not really in the South. But so, I think it's wonderful that this column highlights where it came from. That's the headline, by telegraph. Look, we've got the up-to-date news. So people's experience of the Civil War was, in this sense, mediated, and they saved their experience of that by making scrapbooks out of what they read. The newspaper was tremendously important. Also, people are reading it on the street, having it read to them. I love this very diverse crowd with a pickpocket, and there's a black gentleman over that way, and there's a couple of Irish people. There's a country man and an Irish woman, and the idea that everybody is here reading the news because it means so much to them. So the Civil War, in addition to seeing this big burst of newspaper reading, sees a big burst of scrapbook making. And people start saving. This is Susan B. Anthony's scrapbook, saving, in this case, maps. So people the newspapers become more visual, and people save those elements. She didn't do it, but there are whole scrapbooks, multi-volume scrapbooks made up of nothing but Civil War news. Others made up of Civil War poetry. And one of the interesting things that looking at scrapbooks allows you to see is that sometimes the same poem was attributed, in one case, to a Southerner, and another, in the same poem to a Northerner. And anybody could read it as both. This is somebody's darling in the whitewashed walls, so somebody's dying, his marble brow, and blah, blah. But lots of Civil War poetry. Newspapers printed poetry for people who were grieving, and it meant a lot to them to see it there, and then they collected it. Sometimes they annotate it, rare moments of annotating in these scrapbooks, where a poem that clearly does not have to do with their relative is annotated with the name of the relative, because it speaks to them about that dead person. So again, one of the things that scrapbooks can be for us as a resource is an understanding of what people's reading meant to them, not just what was published. And that's really quite something. So now these were not, so even though they can be very personal and they can read their own personal lives into a mass-produced newspaper clipping, they're not memorabilia books for the most part. They might have a little swatch of something in there, but basically they're page after page of newspaper clippings. And where did they paste them? Well, they might buy some fancy album like this, these lovely embossed albums, and some of them do. And some of them bought an invention of Mark Twain's, the self-pasting scrapbook. which he came up with and made more money from than from some of his books, because his books kept getting pirated. But this was, you know, it was a thing, and it had a patent attached to it. So he ended up liking patents much better than copyright as a result. And he has wonderful, silly ads that he wrote for it, the before and after ad for his life is improved with the Mark Twain self-pasting scrapbook. Here it is, the old style scrapbook, chaos, mess, profanity. And you can see profanity is the rolling barrels of the loud yelling. The cat, he's sticking himself with the scissors. The cat is stuck in the glue, all of that. But with the Mark Twain scrapbook, peace is restored to the household. Domestic tranquility restored. So that idea is out there. That comes up, that's 1876. So before that, none of the Civil War scrapbooks are Mark Twain scrapbooks. But before that, people are not necessarily buying these fancy pants, elaborate scrapbooks. I shouldn't do that, I guess, bounce up and down. All right, I won't. But here you have a much more typical way of making a scrapbook. Have we got? Yes. So Clara Barton was a school teacher. She had these books where people practiced handwriting. And then when she moved on to her work for the Civil War, for raising money for the Sanitary Commission, she started keeping scrapbooks of her work. And at one point, she writes in her diary that she's so excited that someone has given her the gift of a fresh new scrapbook for her work. So she doesn't have to have this scrappy pasting into the handwriting books anymore. But this is a much more typical thing, taking an old used book that doesn't have any use anymore and pasting over it. And then it looks really good on the bookshelf. Sometimes you see things like ledger books, very frequently, get pasted over. In this case, there's a kind of sense of palimpsest of history of a Civil War ledger for troops is remade as a child's scrapbook 10 years later. All of this meant that it was an extremely democratic practice. Anyone could make a scrapbook. So we have something like this, which is the agricultural report that was given out for free. The U.S. printing office really got going as a big thing in the mid to late 19th century. And people, congressmen would send them out to their constituents because everybody liked having a big fat book that looked good on the bookshelf, even if they didn't think much of the contents, as we can see here. So they would paste them over. Sometimes you see, I don't know if you can quite make it out, but you can see that something's been cut from the middle there. People would cut out the intervening pages to make room so it wouldn't bulge. And here's another one with a patent office report reused as a scrapbook. And then this is what got me started on it. I was just telling Don over here. I was in a used bookstore, and I had already gotten a bit interested in colorful children's scrapbooks. And my friend who I was with mentioned to the proprietor that I was interested in scrapbooks, and she brought this out. I said, Saints Everlasting Rest by Baxter is a Puritan sermon book. What's she showing me this for? Well, inside, instead of Puritan sermons, is The Revolt of Mother by Mary Wilkins Freeman. Does anyone know the story? No? Okay, it's about a woman. It's an 1880s story by a sometimes feminist author. And in it, a farm woman has been living in a decrepit house for a long time, and her husband never builds her a decent house. The daughter's about to be married. Anyway, the husband goes away to buy more cows, and she moves the family into the nice, clean barn, which is much better than the house was. So this scrapbook maker has taken her ratty clippings and moved them into a nice, clean book of sermons. So I love the connection there. And basically, she's pasted over Puritan sermons with a whole different religion of domesticity, because the other stories in it are all connected in that sense, in a way, to that as well. So we start to see this conversation going on between what's underneath and what's on top. Sometimes it's not really, sometimes it's a bit of a stretch, but sometimes it's right out there. It's really quite something. So anyway, these scrapbooks become a breadcrumb trail through people's reading, and a way of seeing what kinds of things they valued. They are ways of managing information. They're kind of the equivalents of our present-day bookmarks, Google, blogging, all the different ways that we bring together and pass along information. And I'm probably way behind in the technology, and I'm sure there are many more analogies I could be bringing in, but it's the same activity. We're passing along information, we're saving it for ourselves, for a future self, and we have to find some way to pull out of this massive amounts of stuff that goes through, that passes under our eyes, and figure out how to save it and make sense of it. So these are ways to share responses to media, and this is what Frederick Douglass is telling his readers to do. He's saying, you know, here's this very valuable clipping, and it's about black service in the War of 1812, I think, and it's a way of saying, look, black men served in the army, look, look. And he's telling his readers to bring it out and use it as ammunition. This is worth saving. And in a sense, it's what some of the abolitionists did in relation to sorry, blanking on their names, but the slavery as it is, which is one of the main earliest non-religiously based abolitionist books, made a point of collecting things from newspapers to make its case. We see Lewis Tappan, an early abolitionist, who also in his scrapbook also examples of media, new kinds of media use. He put out a circular for people, different congregations, to answer about gathering information on their ideas about slavery. So we have his not only saving information, he's a New York abolitionist, he owned a newspaper, and he's also saving items in his scrapbook about that have to do with abolition. This is Harriet Jacobs, who wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. This appears to be an early clipping, a clipping from an early version of her narrative, and it's in his scrapbook. So after this, and then we see, okay, so after the Civil War, scrapbook keeping became even more important. And now I'm going to move on to a couple of different groups, the African Americans that I mentioned, and also women's rights activists. I think I moved a heading around somewhere. Anyway, this scrapbook, this is from a scrapbook made by Joseph W.H. Cathcart. And he made something like, as he says, 265 books. And they were quite enormous, actually. They're like 640 pages, and he puts that on the spine. I love it. They're massive. He saved virtually, he was a black janitor in Philadelphia, and he lived and worked in an office building, and I think that meant that he had these reports that he could paste things over. He uses city directories and things like that. And he saved masses and masses of things about black life, going through the newspapers, but not in books. And this is, again, one of the uses of scrapbooks, to save the history of what was going on. And from the bottom up, here's somebody who, I mean, you can see from his handwriting that he hasn't spent a lot of time in school. He's spent enough to learn to write, and he certainly reads, but he's also, he hardly ever writes anything in his scrapbooks. He's got this sense of a voluminous history. The reason I know about him is that a lot of newspaper reporters went by and looked at and loved seeing his massive scrapbooks of their work. So they write about him because of that. And he also was proud of his work. He embossed them, the great scrapbook maker, J.W.H. Cathcart. So these are actually quite hard to get to look at, because they're at the Moreland Spingarn collection, and they're sort of buried in the back, and they're not even cataloged properly. And this is one of the things that happens with this material, that's in a sense both there and not accessible, not almost lost. And this is, remember that even though he's in Philadelphia, which is somewhat more exceptional, The black scrapbook makers are often living in cities where they're barred from white libraries. Now here's another Philadelphian, William Henry Dorsey, who made over 400 scrapbooks. And again, he was very conscious of black history. He's part of the American Negro Historical Society there, and he knew Cathcart. But so scrapbooks weren't just a ragtag substitute for access to segregated libraries. They were, like the libraries that Dorothy Porter organized at Howard University and Arthur Schomburg's collecting, as Laura Helton has demonstrated, a way of organizing knowledge about black life and history in an expansive and capacious mode. And if you ever looked at the old Dewey Decimal System, black people are like shoved into a couple of decimal points. So this is a way of saying, no, this is a different history. We're here. So many of the scrapbooks that Dorsey and Cathcart made were pasted into old government reports, and they created shelves of important-looking bookcases. So they did a bunch of different things, and they also honored each other. So Dorsey's scrapbook honors an article about Cathcart, so that there's this kind of movement back and forth. Cathcart scrapbooks were left to Cromwell, who was a newspaper, also kept scrapbooks. So there's a sort of chain of handing along. And again, they look scrappy. Here at, I'm jumping around. Here at Columbia, you've got L.S. Alexander Gumby, who left his scrapbooks here. He's a later generation, and I'm not going to look into them show you much about them, but his scrapbooks are here in special collections. He left, I don't know, I think it's about 150 volumes, and you can see some of them in the back of him. He says somewhere in one, oh, there it is, they're on the shelf, they're on his thing there. He had to remake them because they all got destroyed in a flood while he was in the tuberculosis sanitarium. But and then he was friends with Schomburg and had a kind of salon in his house, and he eventually decided to leave them to Columbia, who paid him to organize them for a while. I mean, they didn't buy them from him, but they did that. He says he chose Columbia because they had good-looking boys there. So he was gay, in case you missed that. But and I have much more to say about him. But one of the things that black scrapbooks do is they tell stories without writing anything in the scrapbooks, for the most part. So this is Charles Hunter. I'm not going to go into it too much, but he collected articles about lynching. He was a teacher and school principal in North Carolina. And his are really scrappy looking. He pasted them sometimes he pasted them first on old paper bags, and then he pasted them into his old roll books. And what he did was so it would be an article about a white man who was accused of raping a white teenager. There was a trial, there's evidence, there's, everything is, there's a jury, they go out, they declare the guy innocent. And then he's got that right up next to a clipping about a black man accused of raping a white teenager. And the man is hauled out of jail, lynched. That's that. No trial, no nothing. But he puts them together so that you see that. And you also see the silence of the newspaper. And he doesn't write a word about it, but that's what you can see from it. Again, scrappy looking. And that becomes, that's what I call the language of juxtaposition. It's a way of understanding the world of media and the world and what's going on. And there are a lot of reasons people took that up and kind of encouraged each other in doing it. Black scrapbooks also take up, I'm sorry, here's oh, and I'm going to skip over telling you about William Dorsey's amazing scrapbook of colored centenarians, which is really a way of claiming U.S. history. But I also got very interested in how black scrapbooks were tracking voting rights, very much on people's minds, and it should be on our minds again now. That is, how did the very slow movement towards black men first and then women too, getting the right to vote. So we have this 1830 to 1858, Reverend Jerry Beeman of Connecticut, tracking stories about the African-American struggle for the vote. He has an article here from the 1841 in the Colored American, pressing for continued agitation, calling for a meeting. And Dorsey also, in his Colored Centenarian book, highlighted the achievement of one of the centenarians, said to be 113 years old, who voted. And that Dorsey highlights that, and in his little index, he makes an index to this book. A lot of scrapbook makers, by the way, started indexes, and almost none of them continued them. They all stop in the middle. Dorsey doesn't. And here he writes the John Gibson, he writes an annotation to it, which is voter, age 1/3, April, I can't quite read that, but right now. But he makes a point of annotating it to say that. And then he says he had to be taken to the polls in a carriage and lifted out to vote. So he honors them in the table of contents. Again, we see this with a later scrapbook maker, Warner McGinn, who went to Yale, and so Yale has his scrapbooks. And he, as you can see, is working with a clipping service. That's when you see crayons, scribbles on top of a clipping or on the sides, those hash marks. That usually means it's a clipping service, or somebody's clipping it for him. Anyway, he saves a lot about women's votes as well. And he's an African-American lawyer. He was the protege of, or rather, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Thurgood Marshall was his protege. So there's this history, there's a way of transmitting history. And how did that get shared? Well, Dorsey had what he called his Dorsey's Museum, and he kept scrapbooks and lots of other things to look at there. And people would go and see it. So William Carl Bolivar in Philadelphia says, I felt like breathing the air of Mr. William H. Dorsey's sanctum, where I found him busily engaged in clipping articles for his scrapbooks, with a sense of here's a black space, a free space that he can go, a sanctum, where he can read black history. And here we have Gumby again, Gumby's book studio, which he sometimes called Gumby's scrapbook studio. And you can see on the shelves behind, you can see the scrapbooks laid out and looking very impressive. And Gumby in his wonderful flowered coat. So women kept scrapbooks too. They didn't tend to keep hundreds of volumes of them, at least as I've found. But it may be they're around there somewhere. Mary Church Terrell who was a lecturer and writer, also kept scrapbooks. And she explains, and they're at the Library of Congress, by the way, that she explains that even though she kept getting her articles rejected by one magazine after another, she did continue to write. And then when she did finally get a chance to write something about lynching, she had all the clippings there to draw on. So for several years, I'd been keeping a scrapbook. All I had to do was turn to it and find concrete examples proving that the statements that innocent Negroes had never been lynched and that the Negro was practically the only rapist in the country were absolutely false. This article, entitled Lynching from a Negro's Point of View, was published in the 1904 number of the North American Review. So that's a nice segue to women's rights scrapbooks, because she was both. She was a women's rights agitator. She was a lecturer in 1915 on the suffrage circuit, and also a black rights agitator. So just to back up a little in time, then we've got many women's rights agitators keeping scrapbooks. Susan B. Anthony's scrapbooks were pasted into these old ledgers. You can see, peeping out the corner, you can see some various columns of numbers. And in one article, she thanks the businessman of Rochester for giving her these scrapbooks, or these books. Now, whether she means somebody fell and found them on the street and they were given to her in a metaphoric sense, or people actually gave them to her, I don't know. But here's how she begins her scrapbook. She has copied out an article from the what am I thinking of? I'm sorry. It's from the William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, an abolitionist newspaper, and it's the objection to having women speak in public from conservative thinkers who were pro-Southern ministers attacking women for speaking in public. She copies it out. Now, why would she copy that out and waste her scrapbook space on it? Well, because in a sense, the rest of the scrapbook is a rebuttal to it. So when a woman assumes the place and tone of a man as a public reformer, her character becomes unnatural. She shouldn't be speaking in public. So what's next? You turn that over and you get her teaching certificate. Well, what is teaching but speaking in public? So that's one answer. So then the rest of the scrapbook, of course, is also about speaking in public. So there was a lot of controversy about women on the platform. So what were they supposed to do? Well, some of them knit when they were on the platform to perform femininity. Others, wore a shawl over their heads while they were waiting to speak. There were lots of different ruses for what to do. And to some degree, they had to strategize. And what Anthony is showing us is, in a sense, part of her strategy. Now, there's also a sense of a chain of scrapbook, of passing along scrapbooks. That is, Anthony makes scrapbooks memorializing her good friend Elizabeth Cady and coworker Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been making scrapbooks, and her daughter inherited them. So she died in 1902, and Anthony was still alive. And both sets of scrapbooks are at the Library of Congress, and Anthony really had to strategize to get hers placed at the Library of Congress. It wasn't just that she had a sense of history, but at the point she donated them, she wanted the congressmen, there weren't any people, it was all men, to read them, because that wasn't a public space that anyone could go into, but this was a space that she wanted them to see what she had been doing. So leaving it and getting it accepted was a big move. But this is what, and that had much later, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's scrapbook entered, and that was partly the agitating of Harriet Stanton Blatch, her daughter, who really turned her mother's scrapbook. She was really sort of a press agent for her mom. Sorry, that was mean. But she is one reason why we know so much about Stanton and Anthony, as opposed to some of the other activists. So she took her mother's scrapbook and she annotated it. So that's her handwriting there. She takes it in a kind of historiographic direction. This was the scrapbook kept by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She writes that in 1914. And she annotates things with this, she pastes in things like a commemoration from 1908. So it's way out of date for her mother's work on it. And she also annotates around this business about, so there's she reframes them in relation to her mother's memory. But that's not what her mother was doing in her scrapbook. What her mother did was take newspaper articles that had appeared, say, about the Seneca Falls Convention, and she annotated these anonymously written articles, and it was quite conventional for articles to be unsigned, but she would annotate them with the name of the writer that she knew. So she would know for future reference which newspaper editors were sympathetic and which were not. It was a working book for her. Her daughter turns it into a historiographic document. So there are very different uses of it, and you can see all these layers in it. But in a way, Blatch is kind of obscuring the work her mother was actually doing with the scrapbook. But again, this chain of scrapbook use, and now to jump to another sort of more disregarded suffragist who kind of got read out of that whole world, Lily Devereux Blake, who, although for a long time, her PS6 was named after her. Her daughter was the principal there, but it isn't called that anymore. But she used, like Woolf, used scrapbooks for her writing and speaking. And she wrote about scrapbooks as well, and that's why I showed you the cover of Fettered for Life, which is a really good read, by the way, and has a twist in it that you'll enjoy. So Blake, in her novel, has a whole discussion of the transmission of scrapbooks. The main character, the doctor, offers her protege, shows her protege her own scrapbook that has all of these materials that she has found. She clips, in this case, so a book containing clips is a scrapbook. So they're having this conversation. She says, there's legal authority for a man's abuse and ill treatment of his wife? Certainly. Here are a few instances of man's brutality and its reward, taken from various papers in which I have preserved. The doctor opened a drawer in a table and took from it a book containing slips. From these she read, John W. Smith, who beat his wife on the head with a crowbar, was lately sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. So this is very much along the line of what she saved in her scrapbook, too. Here it's made of an old date book. So that idea that you would save material that then gets transferred into a book or then gets transferred into lectures, and that you could then demonstrate to somebody else how to do this. This is an important way of saving data and then reusing it in a way that will move people or has authority to speak, gives you, that you know what you're talking about. You've got these actual cases. So many other suffragists, women's rights activists kept scrapbooks, and a number of them used the Mark Twain self-pasting scrapbook. And it's a funny kind of thing. I don't know if you can make out the figure there. It's a cherub holding aloft the scrapbook and kicking over the glue pot. And that's because it using the scrapbook liberated you from a glue pot. It was just like an old postage stamp. You would bring a sponge or something wet and wet the page, and then you could slap your scrap on it. And lots of suffragists started doing that. It was cutting-edge technology, so to speak, and you could carry it around with you. Elizabeth Boynton Harbert, whose scrapbooks are at the Huntington in Pasadena, and I can tell you I'm going to skip over what I would tell you about that, because she actually had there's sort of a juicy, interesting thing she did with her mom, with her scrapbooks. And again, there you can see more of those, the cherub with the scissors, holding the net. And one of the other people who kept scrapbooks and again, Library of Congress, and many of them are and they're all online now, is Anna E. Dickinson, who was a speaker and writer, well known for her public speaking first as an abolitionist and then as a women's rights activist. And she also had a massive lawsuit. She also got imprisoned in a mental institution, but she was quite a character. And she traveled all over, so the Mark Twain scrapbook was very handy for her. She didn't have to carry a glue pot on the train. And again, what I said about indexes, hardly anybody uses the index. She just used it as another page. What changes in the second round of the suffrage movement is that people start using another new technology, not just Mark Twain scrapbooks, but the Clipping Bureau. And the Clipping Bureau was an institution, gets going in a small way in the 1880s, much more in the 90s, and then really takes over for a lot of the functions of scrapbook keeping. That is, you could hire this Clipping Bureau to keep an eye out for any mention of a particular name or of the Weather Bureau would hire them to, certain kinds of storms, and they would keep a book of that. Anke Tehesen has a wonderful book where she talks about, it was somebody who thought Albert Einstein was a complete idiot and hired a Clipping Bureau to keep track of his mentions of Albert Einstein in the press so he could show what a jerk he was. But what's special for the suffragists is they really start to use that as an engine, as a way of keeping track of coverage of what's going on in the situation of women. It allows them to understand a more widespread, a greater range of what's going on for women's rights around. And so this is, you can see this National Press Intelligence Bureau working, clipping for, in this case, the Smiths in upstate New York, who were, great keepers of scrapbooks. So the women's rights scrapbooks are also using that language of juxtaposition, as we saw with Lily Devereaux Blake, and trying to bring together these different kinds of ideas. And this, again, is doing it on a more, just a more industrial level. So, and it changes the look and the shape of scrapbooks. These are more professional, these are more, it's mainly then amateurs. But the newspaper was so important, and keeping track of it was so important in the suffrage movement. And I think this cartoon is a very apt description of, a very apt image of what the end of the suffrage movement, the victory of the suffrage movement. Look at all those newspapers below the bed. She's been up, debauched in newspapers. And so the scrapbooks themselves reflect that kind of orientation to the newspapers. So stepping back, we read the bringing together of homemade histories, this advice, plans, methods, tactics, media critiques, and we can notice how people displaced commercial business records with their business. They displaced government reports with what ought to have been reported and sent out, not just by congressmen, but by congresspeople, a term that didn't exist. They scraped fragments from newspapers, saved them from the trash, and made them vital. They saved that history that they wrote with scissors and glue with their neighbors and friends and libraries. They made these compilations over the course of years and over the course of decades. And we owe it to these scrapbook makers to pay attention. So I'll end there, but so if you have questions or comments, I'll be glad to yak some more and even show more pictures if you want. Yes?
What happened in the long run? Does anybody make scrapbooks now, and when did it come out of fashion?
Well, people do make scrapbooks now, but now it's a huge fashion for memorabilia scrapbooks. It's a billion-dollar industry, in fact, and there are magazines about it and plenty of websites and whole stores devoted to buying little cutesy things that you can do. And mostly they've contracted, I mean, they've expanded in a sense of being an industry. They've contracted in their interest to be family-centered. And that partly has to do with who started them up again, which is the Mormons. But a particular Mormon took them up as a kind of thing and got lots of people interested. But those were personal documents, and that whole strain of scrapbook making really comes out of young people started making school scrapbooks in the 1880s and 90s. It was a way of documenting their changing life. But scrapbooks like this are much more rare. I've heard of people making them, say, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, but as much more news goes online, I think people generally don't. There's another reason they also fall out of favor, and that is, and I didn't bring one, but the invention of the file cabinet, of vertical files. So people no longer want to paste things down, they put them into file folders, and then they can move them around, which means they no longer are a record of reading. They're a record of just a bunch of stuff in a file folder. So different kind of thing. But we all do make other kinds of ways of saving information, like bookmarks and favorites lists and all of that. So that's continued.
But the internet must have really destroyed this culture, no?
Well, because it's destroyed the paper newspaper, so people don't relate to that. On the other hand, when Obama was elected, lots and lots of people bought the paper so they could have the front page that said that. I'll bet some Trumpists did too, but I don't know them. So, but no, I know that the Obama front page sold out, and they needed, I don't know if they reprinted it, but it was very hard to get a copy because suddenly everybody wanted the paper, which they hadn't been buying very much by then. So, yeah.
I'm curious about how you did your research. Like how many different libraries did you go to? Historical centers, right? That's where you got most of your material?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, I was teaching at a state college in Jersey, which not the Rutgers system, but one that didn't really care much about research. And what I did was, whenever I traveled anywhere, I would write ahead to various libraries and repositories that I'd heard of or that I knew of, and ask if they had scrapbooks. As I got more interested in particular angles, African-American scrapbooks, women's rights scrapbooks, poetry scrapbooks, Civil War scrapbooks, then I could direct my queries a little more definitively. They're hard to find. They're not always cataloged terribly well. The wealthier libraries are able to sometimes have form genre search available. Not every library online catalog has that. So then I could do form genre for scrapbook and not just turn up every use of the term in a title, which is useless. And then I made friends with the archivists because they tended to know, oh yeah, we do have this whole collection, but they're buried in somebody's family papers, so go look over here, you know, and then they'd bring them out. So then I got a bunch of fellowships that took me to one library or another as I applied to them, of course. But then whenever I was visiting anywhere, I would, extend the trip a few days and go rummage. I had a fellowship at the National Humanities Center in Durham, in the Research Triangle Park, so that got me to a whole bunch of Southern scrapbooks, and that was really revelatory, so I saw some of the differences there too. I mean, each scrapbook is sort of a whole revelation and a whole world, and so the work is very slow to try and make some sense of what. There's a certain mind-reading quality to it of trying to figure out what this person was doing. If you have no information about the maker of the scrapbook, it's pretty well impossible to figure it out, because people could be collecting articles about lynching because they're horrified or because they're cheering it, And that's an extreme example, but there are examples of, there are books of both types. So you want to know what you're looking at.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this, and I've been looking forward to it since last year when it was canceled. But I haven't read your whole book. I have a number of questions, and if you want to answer or, improvise on any one of them, that's fine. I was thinking about our neighbors, the Collier brothers, who died under their piles of newspapers, and I was wondering whether somebody should have tipped them off on how to put them into scrapbooks and live a little longer. The other thing is, I'm very interested in the packhorse librarians and their scrapbooks and how that
you differs. Sent me that article.
And then the Dorsey collection, you mentioned that he had like 28 or something on Native American information. Where is that set of scrapbooks? Never mind.
In limbo, I'll tell you.
One more random thing is, should we assume that all our grandparents had scrapbooks?
Great-grandparents, more likely, if they lived here.
No, for me, it would be grandparents. Anyway.
Okay. It's a good question. I mean, it really depended on, if they went to school before 1900, they were probably encouraged to make scrapbooks in school. It was something that shows up in teacher training manuals and in librarian manuals. Libraries kept scrapbooks. Then they shifted to the vertical files. But what happens, though, is that one reason some scrapbooks have been saved and others have disappeared has to do with with privilege, the capacity to leave it somewhere. So Dorsey may have gone. There's a book. Roger Lane has a book called William Henry Dorsey's Philadelphia and Ours, which relies on the scrapbooks quite a lot, but doesn't really analyze them as scrapbooks, as historians mostly do. But, as I say, they use the scrapbooks, but they don't think, oh, he's making scrapbooks, how interesting. But he thinks Dorsey went blind 5 or 10 years before he died, so there's a gap. He stops making scrapbooks for some time before he died. He left them to his son, who left them to the Institute for Colored Youth, which eventually became Cheney University. And they had them, but they didn't care about them. They put them, there are several different accounts. Either they kept them in a janitor's closet, they put them behind a wall and put up a new wall. They did some other thing that basically got them lost for a long time. They were found again in the 60s, and the school, which is, historically black college with virtually no resources, got a small grant from the NEH to microfilm them. So there are microfilms of them that Cheney owns. You can go and look at them there. They didn't, but it's a horror story. It's one of these, I don't know what's happened lately. The last time I checked, nothing. Somebody at Penn State University got the great idea to use some of their money to help out Cheney. So they moved them all over there, started preserving them properly, acid-free, this and that, moving some of the files, because he also kept massive files, and putting them into some better state of preservation. And they're, it's like this huge warehouse with huge amounts of pallets and all that. Then the woman who had taken up that project died suddenly. She was a young woman. And they had never really made proper written agreements about anything. So as far as I know, all the boxes are in limbo at Penn State, but nobody can use them. And they haven't been able to work out the thing with Cheney. So I don't know what's happened. Various people retired in the meantime. So it's this amazing resource that nobody can look at. And the microfilm is probably, Roger Lane made a copy of the microfilm that he gave to Temple, which now doesn't know where it is. So, what can I tell you? So I think the scrappiness contributes to the difficulty of preservation, of librarians taking them seriously, and the fact that they don't come with an endowment to fix them up or to save them really means that they don't get looked at properly. Yeah.
What you just said makes me ask a question that really troubles me. That sad story of a great data set sitting someplace inaccessible because of a failure to document it. Is it fair to say that 100 years from now, that will be the universal reality of all our digitally saved resources which are locked in behind password and not at all made available from one person to another? As of now, I'm looking at this room and I'll bet there is no chance of any of the papers we have on bookshelves and scrapbooks winding up in a resource available for anyone else, because we are constrained inside the little walls of our digital universe. What do you think?
Well, I know there was a lot of concern a while ago about, floppy disks not being readable any longer, and now CD-ROMs not being readable any longer. So there's that. That the media themselves lose the ability to we lose the ability to read the media. But I don't know. What you're raising seems, because all of it seems to be in the cloud, somewhat permeable. But, maybe Elon Musk decides we shouldn't have it anymore, and then boom, it all disappears. That's the question, is what resources exist to hold on to them. You have the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine is its old nickname. You have a lot of initiatives that are about preserving papers. You have libraries like Columbia, which may be firewall-old. I have the, some of us, if you have the great privilege of being able to use their digital resources, that's amazing. If not, who knows? Some of these things do disappear, some of the resources. One thing about scrapbooks, because they contain newspaper clippings, for a long time, it was assumed that, we all have the newspapers. We all have the digital. It's all digitized now. We don't have to save those. Now, one scrapbook I didn't go to, which I could show you a little about, here is Alice Dunbar Nelson's scrapbook, her suffrage scrapbook. of a 1915 campaign. She was an African-American, the widow of Paul Lawrence Dunbar, and she made very good use of that name and getting more publicity. Her scrapbook was left to her niece, who sold it with other papers to the University of Delaware. And again, people would assume that all of the newspaper clippings in it are digitized somewhere else, but in fact, not. In fact, she wrote this campaign, which is otherwise unknown except for this scrapbook, and I've written an article about it, which you can read if you want, was covered in small town papers, and those are not digitized for the most part. Almost none of the articles that are in her scrapbook are anywhere on the internet, including the ones in the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a major black paper. But the Pittsburgh Courier is digitized except for a little, 5-10 year swath, which is missing. And it doesn't tell you that anywhere in its write-up, but they're not there. So all of that, that's a kind of loss as well. I mean, people too often imagine that stuff is digitized that is not, and then are more likely to discard it.
I think there's a flip side to that. One is what we lose, and the other is we have too much information now. And too much is sometimes as bad or worse than just a little bit. And putting things into order and relating them to one another is really important. And we've actually, I think, in science gone the other way with these meta-analyses, which just take any old thing and put them all together and thinks that they're analyzing something when they're not, in my humble opinion. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.